Thank you for listening to Scandinavian Crimes Podcast. Be sure to check out the episode links and be part of our other social media platforms where you can leave a topic suggestion or even share some of your insights regarding the subject matter of the episode. We will always do our best to provide a well-researched episode, but sometimes due to limited access to information and translation issues, some information can be lost. It is therefore good to do your own research and get a deeper understanding of a case of your own interest. So with that all said, let us start today's episode.
Welcome to Scandinavian Crimes. My name is Devante, and say hello to my lovely co-host, Delila.
Hello, everyone.
And on this podcast, we will cover famous Scandinavian criminals who made their mark throughout Scandinavian history. So today's story is a bit different compared to other stories and kind of cases we've told before. One day on October 1994, 4 children played outside in a freshly fallen snow area. A very normal, fun, pretty much great day drastically shifted into a nightmare where one of the children ended up being killed. Her name was Silje Redergård, a 5-year-old girl who got abused and left behind in the cold to die all alone. In this episode, we will dig deep into the details of this incident and discuss the criticisms of this case and how it affected pretty much investigation processes moving forward since this case happened. So today, this is the story of Silje Marie Redergård. Silje Marie Redergård was a 5-year-old Norwegian girl who allegedly was killed by 2 boys in the suburb of Rosten at Tiller near Trondheim on October 15th, 1994. The boys aged 5 and 6 were claimed to have beaten, kicked, stoned, and stripped Redergård completely naked, leaving her in the snow to die of hypothermia. The boys were directed to undergo a psychological evaluation as Norwegian law did not allow the punishment of minors under the age of 15. The names of the boys were never publicly released. And I will preface by saying this, that all the interrogation for this investigation took place over the course of like 2 to 3 days. So even the format of this episode will be a little bit different because I'm giving you a summary right now, but then I'm going to go through the process in which this investigation took place because of the fact of how things were handled and how controversial. So we're going to actually give you, day to day on how things actually took place and what happened. Now be mindful, these things, when I mention the day, some things happened on the same day concurrently. So if you go look that information up and you see that some information was going on at the same time as other information, just know that. But we're not going to mention the times each day. I'm just going to mention what took place on each day, just so you guys understand. So during the initial investigation in 1994, police technically never followed up with the claims reported by the 5-year-old and the 6-year-old that the girl had been killed by rampant teenage boys, even though the children's statement matched what had also been observed and reported by separate witnesses. Police ignored. When police ignored the witness reports matching the children's own statement, Cripples expert Angel explained the prints of the children's boots in the snow could not be connected to the 2 boys. And basically, there was no forensic evidence that existed that connected them to her death. Redergård's mother Beth and stepfather Jorgen Burlap assumed that the serial killers would have been adults as well, but it wasn't until the following day that they discovered the alleged truth. And in the most shocking manner, the parents of Silje Redergård received news from one of the alleged perpetrators, the 6-year-old boy, and his mother. When Beth asked the 6-year-old what he did, the child responded, quote, "I jumped on her because I thought she was sleeping, and I took off her clothes because I thought she was sleeping," end quote. On October 15th, after a few hours of investigation, the police began their initial interrogation of the little boy, who spoke to both Beth and Jorgen. Despite what was said to the parents, he claimed that he saw 3 youngsters approach Redergård who was mean and abusive to her. He also described their clothes and what they did, and in great detail as well. He also stated that he had seen one of the most aggressive and abusive teenagers in the group passing his house with a bicycle a couple of days prior to the incident. During the 5-year-old's investigation, the boy tells the police chief about 2 naughty and 3 nice teenagers who come to the place. So just in case, once again, for some reason you're not keeping up or you're confused, there was technically 3 children there, 1 5-year-old, 1 6-year-old, and there is a 4-year-old, but we'll get into the details of how they correlate to the case a little later. But I'm just presenting the details as they were presented in the court case files. The two naughty boys went over to Redergård and started abusing her in a similar manner to how the 6-year-old described the incident previously. The only difference in their story was the number of teenagers present during the incident. Since the start of the interrogation, the policeman had a good impression of the 5-year-old and he seemed very trusting. The boy was calm and precise in his wording for the 5-year-old. Due to both the boys having similar stories, they both seemed to be trustworthy as the witnesses, and the next morning the newspapers write that the police are looking for 3 young teenage individuals. After the initial round of interrogation, a 4-year-old's father arrives at the criminal department and is questioned as a witness. He explained that when he heard about the murder of Redergård, he asked his son if he knew anything, to which his son replied, quote, "Silje had blood on her face," end quote. When the parents asked their son why she was bleeding, he responded, quote, "She was so wet, she became even wetter because the others had taken her clothes off and wet her," end quote. It was realized that the 4-year-old boy was present during the murder of Silje. Police superintendent and researcher Asbjørn Rechlu believes that the interpretation of the 4-year-old's explanation may have led to many misunderstandings. For the police report, it is difficult to know what the 4-year-old meant by the others. However, there was no doubt the father and to the police investigator who questioned the father that evening that the others were synonyms with the 4-year-old's playmates, the 5-year-old and the 6-year-old. On October 16th, the information that the father and the 4-year-old gave changed the police's focus. They summoned the 4-, 5-, and 6-year-olds for additional questioning. First up is the 4-year-old, their new witness in the case. On this day, the 4-year-old explains in detail about the serious assault that Redergård was subjugated to and clearly states the names of the culprits, the 5-year-old and the 6-year-old. They took her clothes off, kicked her in her chest and head, and jumped on her while she was lying in the wet snow. The 4-year-old further describes that Redergård tried to get away, but that she is caught and the abuse continues. While Redergård screamed for help, bleeding from the mouth, eyes, and head, the 4-year-old stood and watched because he was too scared to do anything. Even though he never stated he was a part of the assault, he was still on the suspect list with the other 2 boys. At the same time that the 4-year-old was being interrogated, a new interrogation of the 5-year-old begins. The boy begins by explaining the same story as the night before. Then the police chief asks the 5-year-old if he knew who was mean to Redergård. To this, the 5-year-old suddenly tells a completely different story and changes his narrative. He says that the 6-year-old and the 4-year-old abused Redergård and that there were 2 other children on the scene, a girl and a boy, who had held Redergård while also abusing her. After 10 minutes, the 5-year-old finally admits that he himself kicked her and threw a stone at her head. The last one to be questioned was a 6-year-old boy who was accompanied by his mother. The 6-year-old begins by telling the same thing as the night before. The police chief then said to the boy that both the 5- and 4-year-old were now at the police station, that their stories were different from what the 6-year-old had said. The 6-year-old was adamant and kept insisting that what he said was true and that if the other 2 said otherwise, they were the ones who lied. There is no fully known motive for the killing, although one of the boys told the detective that, quote, "We beat her till she stopped crying," end quote, during the initial investigation, perhaps explaining the partial reason to why they would beat her to death. Why 2 little boys should have inflicted such terrible violence on a playmate will never be known. Quote, "We beat her till she stopped crying," end quote, one of them later told the police. A clue perhaps as to why the viciousness of the attack even escalated in the first place, but not as to why it should have occurred. Even though people could not understand the motivation behind how the kids possibly could have done something so violent, there were also reports that one of the boys had been sexually abused before the attack. Nobody said the boys were evil. Neither they were branded criminals, or nor would they have been. Many experts in the field question and criticize how the case was handled. So this part of the kind of episode, we're going to go over the criticisms of the investigation. So the information you previously heard was what was documented from the police's perspective. So this is going to be information to how some experts and even some of the public and even some news sources kind of reflected on the process in which the police conducted their investigation. The interrogation was just very unjust, and the kids and parents never received any information about their rights or lawyers. The children were also presumed during the interrogation in various ways. This resulted in the children changing their stories and even adding information that was impossible to do in real life for children of their size and age. The interrogation methodology at the time was characterized by a culture of confession where legal tricks were used to get the suspect to confess. The police investigations in 1994 had no training in interrogation or methodology or witness psychology, which was a huge misjustice to the children involved. They also made their whole witness report untrustworthy. The National Criminal Investigation Service expert Per Angel has explained that the prints of the children's boots in the snow cannot be connected to the 3 boys who were found. Like I mentioned earlier in the story, there was no evidence directly tying them to the area, which means their story couldn't have been properly corroborated at the time, and the police knew that going forward. On October 18th, 1994, the television channel TV3 suspended the airing of certain cartoons that showed aggressive behaviors and debated the impact of fictionalized violence in a television program aimed at children. Norway's prime minister at the time commented that Norwegians should think twice before allowing such free market violence to be broadcasted by commercial networks. The boys were directed to undergo a psychological evaluation as Norwegian law did not allow the punishment of minors under the age of 15. Both boys were ordered to regularly meet with Child Protective Services and undergo counseling until they turned 18. One of the boys has suffered from drug addiction and homelessness, alleged due to some part in his role in killing Silje. Ase Preitz Slethmion, who managed the caseworker responsible for supervising the care of the boys for 8 years after Redergård's death, is clear about Norway's policy of avoiding the criminalization of the young. Clearly, great care was taken to ensure the 2 boys were protected rather than punished. The boys are now 18, and Preitz is adamant that there have been no serious problems and neither of them has been involved in violence or criminal activities since. And that is the story of Silje Redergård. So one thing I want to start the discussion off before we full-blown get into the whole, chat about this is the fact that I don't like how in the criticism section of this story is that off rip the government and a lot of people wanted to blame cartoons. And it's the same kind of ideology that people have against violent video games. Most instances of violence have no connection to cartoons, no connection to actual video games. It's rarely due to what people have seen on TV. Oftentimes, it is a reflection of what is going on in the home between the child and the parent. So when you think about it like this, I live in America, right? So let's say if we were to blame, video games for, that's the reason why there's a lot of mass shootings. That was the theory like 10 years ago when this stuff was happening, when it was really ramping up in the United States. Come to find out, it had nothing to do with video games, had nothing to do with cartoons, nothing to do with anything. And this is like freshly when I'm like getting out of high school, like this is fresh out of high school. But even when I was in high school, that was a theory. But it had nothing to do with video games. It had to do with the psychological component of the person, where sometimes it came from really abusive homes or really toxic homes, or maybe they had a really rough school life. They were getting bullied. A lot of school shooters, at least a good chunk of them, did have racial motivations for sure in the US specifically. So it had nothing to do with cartoons. It was how they were raised in their house. They were brought up with hateful prejudice, and then they went out and sought to kill tons of people. Because, people don't know this, but not only most of the serial killers are white, most of school shooters in the US are white, but even in predominantly black countries like in South Africa, where there is more black people, white people are still the highest in serial killers and mass shootings, because unfortunately it's a cultural thing. There's something about the culture that's causing, children to kind of, express themselves in very toxic ways. Now, there is obviously a racial correlation, but I'm not getting into all that. That's super political. The point I'm making is it's never the video games. It's almost never the cartoons. It's simply just an environment that people refuse to take into account. Cartoons are not responsible for turning your kids violent. It is the home environment. It is, some external source that is not coming from the cartoons. Oftentimes, even I think at the time they said they stopped Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, even though they were ninjas and they were turtles, they did preach a lot of positive rhetoric, and most cartoons still do. So it ain't the cartoons, it ain't the video games, it's something else going on in the home. if that was the case. But that's one thing I want to say before we get out the way, because I don't like when they say stuff like that, because it's not true, and they know it's true, but it's what they often do to the public. They try and shift the blame to something else in order to kind of get this public scare, like this mass hysteria regarding cartoons or video games or something like that. And then they just put the blame on something else instead of addressing the real problem. And this is not exclusive to the US. A lot of governments do this. They manipulate their public to figure things that are not the problem and make it seem like they're doing their job, when the real problem is you need to focus on the rehabilitation, the psychology of the person, and the at-home situation. So just wanted to say that. All right, Delila, what have you got to say about this case?
There's a lot of things that I want to talk about this whole case. The first thing that I want to mention is that this case have been compared to another case that happened in England, 1993. And it's the murder of James Bulger. He was a 2-year-old boy in England who was abducted, tortured, and murdered by 2 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables. The difference between them was that in Britain, they basically sentenced them as adults. They put them and exposed them on the media, trying to find them, they really went hard on them. And this resulted to them, being in jail and everything as children, because they were just like 2-year-old boys, right? Even though in this case, the boys that we're talking about was 5 to 6 years old, they're still boys either way. They're still under 15. And they basically, how they handled it in England and Britain, in my case, I think was very harsh. Even though they might have had a better interrogation and trial. I don't really know too deeply about the case, but they were very harsh on how they handled it because they got national news media exposure. And I think that Norway, that believe in not sentencing teenagers under 15 years old to be a valid reason, and they want to help them and not return to the criminal ways, or especially if they are kids that they're not aware of the situation in the same way. So they decided to monitor them, therapy sessions, being there for them through the whole time. And it actually did good. They didn't do any criminal acts. They never wavered in their ways. They were doing pretty good, living normal lives. And the people of Norway couldn't really blame them either, because they were playing. They didn't know any better. And everyone kind of saw this as a very tragic event. And they felt sorry for the kids and also for Redergård as well. And it was a very unfortunate situation. And they wanted to make sure that they have a normal life, because the community that everything happened in, they didn't want to expose them. They didn't want to sabotage their lives because of something they didn't really know or were aware of what they were doing, So they all felt bad for everything, the whole situation, and they wanted them to have a normal life. And even though England and Britain didn't really want to understand this, they said that it was hard to forgive something like that, even though they're children. My opinion, I think that Norway did a good job, because we already know those who go to jail in a younger age have a higher tendency to go back to criminal acts. So I think that Norway did the best that they could, and I think that the children got a chance because, they didn't really know any better. So that was like one huge thing that they mentioned several times, the comparison of these cases. But another thing is also the criticism of the interrogation. And, if do you want to say something?
Well, one thing I will say this. My biggest issue was with the investigation. They didn't do their jobs. They didn't verify whether or not the children, whether they did or didn't do it completely. It's like they took one aspect of the investigation and completely ran with it. Like it was as if, they just basically invalidated what the kid said, because one thing that is, I only can speak for stats for the US, obviously, but the chances of like two children who were 5 and 6, the chances of them two being able to verify or have two stories that were identical, well, damn near identical. The only difference with one is that one, I think, had one or two more assailants in their story, but the events played out the same. And it's not like these kids had time to, 6 and a 5-year-old was like, let's think about this in the head. They didn't have time for that, nor did they live together for them to verify their story. And this is back when this happened. It's not like these kids had phones either. They didn't have phones, iPads to communicate. There was none of that. But yet their stories were very much almost identical, and the police didn't take the time to investigate to see, is this possibly true? Maybe, these kids, saw something, and unfortunately, that could have happened. I'm not saying they did or didn't do it. That's not the point. I'm not trying to say, if they actually are responsible or not responsible. But as a detective, as a police officer, the whole point of investigation is to, follow all leads. You can't be presented with information and then ignore it, and then you leave yourself open for liability, because already the investigation was flawed via the interrogation process, just how they were interrogating the kids. They didn't inform the parents of their rights, so they never spoke to lawyers. They never did any of that. They were very much already taken advantage of. So that's one liability already that they're still actually liable for to this day. They can sue. They can. Well, I don't know how it works over there, but at least over here, you can actually sue police officers for doing that, even if it's like a case that was pretty much older.
You could. The thing is, they probably didn't know any better. They just believed in the police.
And that's fine, like I said,
back then.
But even then, like I said, till this day, at least in the US, you still can be held liable for something that happened 15, 20 years ago based on an investigation, because it altered the course of your life because of the way that they investigated, or they didn't inform you of your rights and stuff like that. So that's pretty much where my gripe is for a lot of this case, the fact that they just did not investigate, because we still have time. These I can't say kids because they're adults now, but they're still young. 10, 15 years from now, what if someone comes out and says like, hey, I'm the one who's actually responsible for killing this little girl during this time, blah, blah, blah. But then guess what? You didn't put these kids through the interrogation process. You didn't put these kids through there's nothing wrong with going to therapy, but they were going with the intent as if they had committed a crime. Like, because
one of them, the 6-year-old, he actually, even though they didn't really talk about it, he was very traumatically affected by the event throughout his whole life,
And that
so
altered
it did
his life.
affect him, it altered his life. And I think, especially the way it was made, like the whole thing was a mess. During the part where they were searching for evidence, they disregarded a lot of footprints work near the body because a lot of people went there. It started snowing. They lost a lot of evidence tracking there. They just based on what they saw on the football field. Here we see some kids here, but there were a lot of footprints. There could have been multiple people too, because all the 4-year-old, the 5-year-old, and the 6-year-old mentioned there to be older people there, or like teenager looking people, 2 mean or 3 mean, and the 5-year-old said like there was other good guys too. But the way that they said the same things, and I don't think kids in that age are capable of having to match the story on like, let's lie together. They were kids.
And also,
and I'm like,
I think one thing that people, which I didn't like about it either, is that when the 4-year-old described, like, he didn't even describe this. Initially, he didn't describe the 5 and the 6-year-old. He was just like the others, and then the police assumed
it was referring to the other two. And then basically
the father
over time,
and the police, the father, the 4-year-old's father assumed it was the 5 and the 6-year-old.
Yeah, but then, like I said, he's 4. I'm not saying 4-year-olds can't communicate at all, but his...
And then the next day, he just started to, like, from nowhere, describe everything in detail like that.
Yeah,
and also, it was different to what the father stated the day before. So
yeah, there was some level of coercion and story was changing. It was just, like I said, most of this case, honestly, I don't really have like too much to say about it because it's blatantly obvious that it's mostly...
Police were fishing for...
They were fishing for a very specific answer, and they basically built the case around that specific answer, and that's what they wanted. Now, like I said, it's not to say that they were or weren't guilty. We don't know. We truly don't know what truly happened that day. Obviously, I cannot time travel.
This could
so
be considered
a
cold case, honestly.
Yeah.
You know?
So I don't know what happened. I can't really make an assumption of what happened because based on information, this is very incomplete. Like a lot of what happened was incomplete investigation.
Because they didn't do their job.
They didn't really do their job. So we don't have much to work with because they pretty much told you what happened regarding the children. I'm pretty sure a lot of listeners would at least agree that the tactics they used were very suspicious and, fishy. And it's just like we don't have a lot of information to work on because they didn't really do their job. And there was minimal investigating for this kind of case. And like I said, there's a possibility that the person, that might be responsible if they didn't do it could still be very much out there and just never was prosecuted. So
exactly.
that's a possibility. So
or never learned or understood that what they did was wrong because
right.
we don't really know who it was.
And and unfortunately, like I said, this is going to be one of those episodes where it's just like, it's really crazy how things transpired in this case, but also how minimal investigation can cause issues in the future when it comes to police departments and their lack of effort. Because like I said, and I'll always compare it to this, the Manheim murders is a prime example of what you should do as a police station. Like they jumped on it immediately. They didn't wait 24 hours. Like, oh, your child has to be missing for 20, the typical rhetoric. They searched immediately. The second the parents said my children didn't come home, they went out there, started searching. They put out sound devices to capture low-level sounds just in case they were hurt and they couldn't leave somewhere. Unfortunately, they were, killed, because the perpetrators who killed them immediately, but they did their job. They are not liable for anything because they explored every avenue. They talked to every person. They collected every bit of evidence. They did everything they could to make sure that they could get the result of the children being alive still. And like I said, not their fault. They didn't do anything wrong. That is top-notch investigation. That is top-notch police work. That is what it's about. But in this case, they did the exact opposite. They just wanted a quick confession, seal the case, end it right there. Because this took place over 3 days? And I'm just like, and then even then, those 2-3 days, they didn't do anything. They did nothing else really.
They did
interrogate the kids and force the kids to say
yeah.
stuff. So that's where the problem is. So I don't really have much to say because that's where my problem is with the case. So in the whole violent video game thing situation that I mentioned, earlier when we started this conversation, how they try to blame violent TV shows. I didn't like that either. But I already gave
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Power Rangers or whatever they.
Yeah, I didn't like that because I was like, that's also the problem as well.
Proven.
Yeah, I'm like, you just shifting the blame to something else. And I'm like, anyone who knows the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that even was playing back then, those cartoons always promoted a positive message. And it wasn't like they were just fighting for the sake of fighting in most of those episodes. Half the time it was because someone was doing something wrong and they were protecting innocence. So even then, a lot of cartoons promoted positive messages, but then unfortunately,
especially back then.
Especially back then. It was
today everything's just random, but like back then they really had positive, even though it was action here and there, it was still a positive message in the end of the episode.
But then they want to shift the blame to something else, and unfortunately, that's I'm gonna say it's a boomer mindset. Like it's cartoons.
I mean, that's
it's video
typical,
games.
back
I'm
then.
like, it's been proven that none of those things are what caused
Rock
any of the violence.
music is satanic.
Yeah, like they try to blame everything else but the problem itself, and I'm like, I don't know. I'll just be over it. But besides all that, I ain't got much to say. I don't know if you got anything else to say.
I can at least say something. I have a theory of who it could have been, and based on the information that we have, we know that the 6-year-old told Redergård's mother, Beth, in this case, that he did jump on her, and because she thought she was sleeping, and even though he didn't say that, or we don't know, but we think he didn't say that to the police, because he was very, he said that I didn't do it, right? Basically that he was not part of the whole situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, based on all the stories that everyone said of the kids, and also their chain of story and everything, they probably all were part of this, but they didn't want to take blame for it. So I think that they probably mentioned some truth in it, but they didn't want to take the blame for it because they knew they did something bad. And then it ended up them having to say that, okay, I did take part of some things, and that everything was just pinpointed on the 5-year-old and the 6-year-old. I do believe that there probably were children out there because it was a playground, and many were being mean to her for some reason. So I think that there were multiple kids who did harass her and being mean to her, and the one who got caught ended up being the 5 and 6-year-old in this case.
I'm just gonna throw it
this is just my theory. I don't really know if it's if it's just like that, but I think that kids aren't capable of having so accurately describing something, and then probably also they could have imagined everything, but to all 3 of them to imagine the same or similar things, I mean, that's a little questionable to me.
But that's also possible as well. That's happened before, shared, like the case we did with the sisters, shared, even though there was a mental illness behind it, but only one of them was getting abused, but yet they had a shared hallucination. Now, I'm not saying the kids were hallucinating, but a mass hysteria can convince groups of people that they're experiencing the same thing.
That is true.
So,
I still have my theory. But y'all know already my theories are trash. They're like 90% wrong. But I think it's fun to just theorize everything.
I'm just throwing out something random that no one would expect. But who knows? If, let's say, the case reopens and somehow it comes to light, just know.
Experts think so, and many people still think that it should be, it was a mistrial.
Yeah. So. But I'm going to give a theory. And this is going to be random. I don't think it was a 5, 6, or even 4-year-old. I think the 6-year-old's parent who made him call the other parents was the one who killed the girl. And he tried to put the rap on his child knowing that he
Wait, who are you talking about? The mother of the 6-year-old or?
The 6-year-old, because was it the dad or the mom who made the 6-year-old call?
The father was the 4-year-old's
because it was the 6-year-old had called the victim's parents and was like, basically told them what happened. And I'm like, the parent who made the 6-year-old tell the parent what happened, I think they might be responsible, knowing that their kids wouldn't see jail time. It's random, completely random, but you never know. Honestly, there have been cases. I
can also tell you that the mother of the 6-year-old was the one that was there first and tried to do CPR and try to save her.
Yeah, so
I didn't put it in the text though, like in the story, because it was too much information. But she was there first because the 6-year-old went to the mom. Hi, I think she's dead. She went there, tried to save her, couldn't do it because she was, already dead. And there was another boy, an 8-year-old, that went and told the mother of Redergård.
Yeah, so
that was actually...
There's a lot of variables, and like I said, we encourage you to look it up.
There's a lot of kids going on there.
Yeah, we encourage you to look it up. There's a lot of stuff that was happening that we just could not mention everything, because then it'll end up being one of those situations where like, okay, well, we're going to get a part 2 then, and I don't want to do that every episode.
It's going to be like a 5-hour long...
Yeah, so I would say just look up the information, but I think like it's definitely possible that there's enough plausible deniability with the children at the time that they didn't do it. There's enough, there's that window is huge. It's not impossible that they, couldn't have done it, but there's enough leeway that there's like doubt. There's a substantial amount of doubt. So I don't know. Let me know. What do y'all think? Make your own opinions and theories and stuff like that.
I would like also to end it with a question to the audience. Like, do you think that children are evil in the core? Like, do you think that the kids were actually able to understand what they were doing and they did an evil act? Or do you think that they just kids can't be evil? Some people believe that kids can be born or be evil, and some people, think the other way. So it's a question for you guys. Do you think that they were evil? Do you think they were lying? Or do you think that they were telling the truth? Or that they were confused and didn't know any better?
Let us know. Like I said, just be sure to reach out on our social media platforms like Instagram, Facebook. Let us know what y'all think. And like the typical episode ritual, let's end it on a nice positive food note. What's a food for today that I think everyone should?
I ate some crackers and I'm still craving the crackers. It's like cheese crackers, so
that's so basic. Let's go above and beyond. I'm definitely vibing for some nice chicken and waffles. That's something that's
American. That sounds like an American.
It is
thing.
American, but I guarantee you're gonna be like, oh my god, it's amazing, and then you won't be able to live without it. So
okay, let me rephrase mine then. To all the Swedes out there, I'm craving knäckebröd with some cheese and some butter. That's what I'm craving right now. You don't know what that is?
Nope, but
and
it
that's
sounds
fine.
But yeah, just end it on a positive note. And I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Let us know what you think and answer Delila's question. And we will see you next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.